The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Breaking news out of Austin, Texas, in the Round Rock area, part of the greater metro area there. Word that the Austin serial bomber is dead, committing suicide as law enforcement closed in. Tony Plahetsky of the Austin American-Statesman with some terrific reporting, confirming that with law enforcement officials that the suspect himself used an explosive device. Though we caution, there is also reports saying that the suspect, the serial bomber, was shot by police as the SWAT team closed in.
We do know that Austin police confirming there was an officer-involved shooting. So again, very dramatic last moments here.
So it appears that the bomber in Austin, Texas has finally been caught. I had a suspicion on yesterday that the intensity and the frequency with which he was carrying out the bombings was ultimately going to lead to him getting caught sooner rather than later. He became overconfident and increased the frequency with which he was committing these acts of terrorism, and he has subsequently been caught. We know that he is a 24-year-old white male. We don't know much more about him as far as motivations, his background, but we do know his name, Mark Anthony Conditt, 24-year-old. He was killed in a exchange with the police. He was shot and ultimately took his own life with an explosive device that he left for himself. And before I go any further with what I'm actually talking about today, I want to pause and think about the victims, those who were injured, but most specifically those that were killed. 39-year-old Anthony Stephen House, a father who originally police said accidentally killed himself. And then it turns out that that's not the case. And then 17-year-old musician and athlete and just a Renaissance man, 17-year-old Draylon Mason, both killed by this bomber. And you would think that in the context of the tragedy of it, even though we did not have the mystery of it solved until today, the tragedy of it, you would think that the president of the United States would have had something to say, because he so vociferously speaks on issues of violence and threats, and particularly terrorism. But it took the president 3 weeks to say anything. And this is what he said when he was finally confronted with the reality that he had to speak up.
It's terrible. The bombings in Austin are terrible. Local, state, and federal are working hand in hand to get to the bottom of it. This is obviously a very, very sick individual, or maybe individuals. These are sick people, and we will get to the bottom of it. We will be very strong. We have all sorts of federal agencies over there right now. We're searching. But these are sick people, and we have to find them as soon as possible. We have to find them really immediately. I will say working with Texas, working with the local governments has been great. But we have to find this very sick person or people.
And you will notice there's no mention of the victims' families, no hearts and prayers. I mean, that's like the obligatory response, but no hearts and prayers, no thoughts and minds, no reference to the pain and suffering, nothing about the victims here, let alone their names. And even less likely you would hear him say anything about their race, that this bomber attacked and focused on black people and did so for weeks. 3 weeks went by, and the president of the United States said nothing about this until he was forced to say something about it by the media. And now, in all fairness to no one, let me just say this. The media should have asked him about this sooner. So the president isn't going to say anything about it, even though he has his own platform that he constantly talks about issues of violence and extremism. He's constantly talking about it on Twitter. I mean, there's a Washington Post article that has a litany of tweets that he gave out immediately in the aftermath, in the hours after terrorist attacks happened anywhere around the world. The president had something to say, even if it was nothing more than thoughts and prayers. but it was generally more along the lines of condemnation of terroristic acts. But here, the president not only said nothing about the victims for 3 weeks, he said nothing about the incidents themselves for 3 weeks. And that's because he knew. Donald Trump knew at an intuitive level that this bomber was going to be white, and he already knew that the victims were black. He watches Fox News enough to get the general details. So it's not as though this was outside of his radar. And even if he wasn't watching Fox News, he's getting daily reports of significant happenings across the country. So he knew at an intuitive level, he may have known expressly, that this was a white bomber. But because of that key component, the president of the United States chose to say nothing. And this is why I formerly called him the white supremacist in chief. But I have to make an addendum. I have to change that. Donald Trump is not the white supremacist in chief only. He is the master of white supremacy, because he knows exactly how to play to the white grievance base in a manner and in a fashion that we have not seen since the 60s, since the civil rights era. Donald Trump has mastered the art of speaking directly to the hearts of people with white grievances without having any political backlash, without having any political fallout. Or if there is fallout, he's able to weather the storm and just keep moving. And so this has given him the ability. He has the uncanny knack of speaking and enabling white supremacist feelings, because he enables white grievance in this country. But then he masterfully walks away from it with clean hands, as though he has nothing to do with the problem that is pervasive in this country. The Anti-Defamation-League reports in their study that 20 out of the 34 extremist-related murders in the United States in 2017, that's roughly 60%, were related to right-wing extremism. And this is an increase over the amount of violence, of murders committed by white supremacists in 2016. And so, in other words, you saw an uptick after the election of Donald Trump. And there is a direct correlation between the two, because in many cases, particularly the case of Heather Heyer, or if you consider the one data point that is outside of the United States, the shooting of 6 Muslims worshiping in Quebec, they were killed by a Donald Trump supporter. There has been an increase. And the fascinating thing about this increase is that they're in power. They are literally the ones in their ideology rests in the White House. I'll get back to that in a moment. But what I have to point out is that Donald Trump has mastered the art of enabling this white grievance, which is the ideology that fuels white supremacy, which is the most violent type of extremism in the country in 2017, and even over a longer period of time. Between 2008 and 2017, extremist killings were even more significant. 71% of domestic extremist-related killings in the United States was committed by right-wing extremists between 2008 and 2017. There's something happening in the United States that we're not talking about in a real serious fashion. And there was a tweet. I'm not sure if I shared it with you before, but this tweet is from an individual. The links will be in the description, at Mark Popham on Twitter. And he said, with an expletive, but I'm going to leave it out. He said, the blanking weirdest thing right now is slowly piecing together that we are in the middle of a white supremacist murder spree, but news outlets don't want to actually admit that. A white supremacist kills 2 people on a train. A white supremacist drives to New York to kill black people. A white supremacist teenager kills his girlfriend's parents. A white supremacist teenager shoots up a school, killing 17. And he has a third tweet that says, quote, I don't need a wall of photographs and a bunch of red yarn to piece this ish together. There literally is a surge of white supremacist killings in this country. And at the core of white supremacy is white grievance. White grievance is the ideology that undergirds all, that transcends all of the various groups. See, what it is like you could play the pedantic game, like, you know, I'm a white supremacist, but I'm not a Nazi. I'm a neo-Nazi. I'm not in the alt-right. I'm the alt-right, but I'm not really those guys. And this is a game that Donald Trump has mastered, right? This is a game that Fox News mastered with Bill O'Reilly, with all of their hosts, with Tucker Carlson, who has taken up the mantle now. But Donald Trump has gone further than anyone could have ever imagined you could take the white grievance ideology. And he's taken it all the way to the White House in 2018. Well, in 2016, but right now it's 2018. You know what I mean, right? It's here. It's living. It's thriving. It's not something that went away with the election of President Obama. It is something that was exacerbated with the election of President Obama. And Donald Trump seized on that opportunity, and he is still doing it to this day. He is completely incapable and unwilling to condemn white violence in this country. Without question, he is completely incapable of condemning it in a substantive fashion. He has mastered the art of giving these empty platitudes of condemnation, like you heard in that clip where he said it's bad, it's horrible, we got to get to the bottom of it. But he won't speak to the core root of it, nor will he even have the decency enough to call the names of the victims, or even reference the names of the victims, or even admit that there were victims. Because if he does that, well, then he opens up the Pandora's box of accountability because of the identities of the victims. They were black people. And Donald Trump is so committed to his white grievance base that he will never, ever condemn the underlying ideology that runs through all of this. Because that is the ideology that got him elected. White grievance. And so what he's had to do, and this is why I refer to him as the white supremacist in chief. I was doing it tongue in cheek, but it's come to me that this is really the literal truth. Donald Trump is a master of white supremacy because he has mastered the art of enabling white grievance that turns into white supremacy and violence without ever having to be held accountable for not only his words and his actions, but the actions or words of anyone who's tied to him or supports him. And he's also mastered the art of crafting out this nice little safe space so that the good white people who won't really commit these acts of violence, but really do believe in the white grievance ideology, really do believe that there's a bad thing happening in America as America becomes more diverse. Those people who really do believe that Mexico is sending over rapists and they're sending over MS-13 gangsters. He's crafted out this nice little way, this place that they can hide and never really be associated or admit their affiliation and association with white supremacy and white nationalists and Nazis. Yet they carry the same exact ideology, white grievance. And Donald Trump has taken that all the way to the White House. He's managed to be there for 2 years, year and a half, going on 2 years, without ever having to be held accountable for people who march in his name, people who wear his hat, people who repeat his ideologies, even at the point of killing someone. Srinivas Kuchibhotla was an Indian engineer who was killed by 51-year-old Adam Puritan in Kansas. And as he killed this man, he asked them, "Where are you from? What nation are you from?" A supporter of Donald Trump. The Nazis in Charlottesville dressed the part, matching Donald Trump, many of them with "Make America Great Again" hats on. The killer in Quebec killed all of those people, all of those worshipers at a Muslim mosque, a supporter of Donald Trump. Over and over and over again, we see people who have been enabled and fueled by the rhetoric of this president, a man who masterfully has been able to take a victory and maintain the appearance of grievance. I mean, think about that. He won the presidency. He is the president of the United States, but yet he's managed to keep in the minds of his white core support group, that 33 to 37% who will never leave him, he's been able to keep the erroneous thought in their mind that they are the ones who are the oppressed. They are the ones who are victimized. They are the ones who are the victims of real racism. They are the only ones who are victims of terrorism, and they are completely incapable of being guilty of terrorism themselves, even though they are committing the most acts of terrorism. Donald Trump has simultaneously shown how you can win while keeping people think that you lost, because he gets the benefits of being the victor as well as the benefits of appearing oppressed. That mobilizing, that galvanizing force that gets thousands upon thousands of people to show up at the drop of a dime because they feel like they've been going through and they have to fight back. Donald Trump has shown white supremacists how they can be both the victor and the victimized, both the oppressor and the oppressed, and get the benefits of both. And that, my friends, is the master stroke. See, we on the left, Democrats, people on the further left, we get off on the fact that Donald Trump is a moron, is a buffoon. But the reality of it is that when it comes down to enabling white supremacy without ever being accountable for white supremacy, Donald Trump is an intellectual genius. And I'm going to make the case for that after this quick break. So as you know, we're in a small, pretty minor fundraising effort. We're trying to raise $500 a month addition to our Patreon account in order to pay for the studios that we would use to record video in. And so as a result, I've asked for 50 new patrons and to give $10 each, and that would cover the expense for our studio. Well, since we've done that, we've started that, we've had a lot of our old patrons, who I really can't thank you enough, who have stepped up and increased their patronage amount. And so I want to thank them, but I also want to thank the new patrons who have come on board. Special thanks to Treva R for your pledge, Jeff, with no last name listed, but that's okay. Thanks for your pledge. Daphne J, thank you for your pledge. Nathan B, thank you for your pledge. And Jeremiah B, great name, Jeremiah. That's my son's name. Thank you so much, all of you, for becoming new patrons. And thanks to everyone who increased their pledges. And now to everyone else who you haven't started pledging yet. You've been thinking about supporting the show all this time. You really have. You've considered it. You watched our show go through ups and downs. You saw how the transition. So you said, I'm going to wait. You waited, and you see where we are now. And you see we're producing amazing content. You really have been thinking about it. Go to patreon.com/the BPD show and become a patron today. And if you, for whatever reason, it's hard times for a lot of people. If you can't do it yourself, find other people who can join in with you. And each of you give $1. Give $1 a month. Get 10 people to give $1 a month. But we want to raise this money because we're going to build this ourselves. That's all the plugging I'm going to do for now. Maybe one little tag at the end. But let's get back to the news and make sure that you go to www.patreon.com/the BPD show, and you'll get access to all the bonus content as you become a new patron and support our endeavors. All right, let's get back to it.
It's on both sides, sir. You said there was hatred, there was violence on both sides.
Well, I do think there's blame. Yes, I think there's blame on both sides. You look at both sides. I think there's blame on both sides, and I have no doubt about it, and you don't have any doubt about it either. And if you reported it accurately, you would say.
That was President Donald Trump after the riots in Charlottesville. You remember that clip. There's more that I want to play later. You're very familiar with that clip, but what I had not considered until I read an article in The Atlantic was that this was actually Donald Trump's master achievement. This was a moment where Trump actually showed intellectual prowess, or at least the ability to equivocate masterfully, such that he did not have to condemn Nazis. He did not have to condemn the obvious condemnation that was required. There was a condemnation of Nazis and white supremacists, but he used verbal contortions to get out of outright having to condemn Nazis. And what I felt at the time of him giving that speech was frustration and disbelief that the president of the United States would do this. Not shock, but just frustration. But I read an article, again, the article in The Atlantic is called "Trump Knows Exactly What what he's doing by David Graham. And when I tell you the article is really good in the sense that it shows you that this is actually the work of a man who is working overtime to make sure that he never alienates his white grievance base.
Kill the person. Heather hired Charlottesville. They showed up in Charlottesville to protest.
Excuse me. They didn't put themselves down as you. And you had some very bad people in that group. But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group. Excuse me. I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history. You're changing culture. And you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly.
I wanted to play that second portion before we jumped into the article by David Graham. And this is what Graham had to say about Donald Trump's verbal contortions there. He said, quote, "It was the clearest and most precise articulation of a view that Trump has espoused since the start of his political career. The president worked to draw a fine distinction between different elements of the march, and in the process to rescue his own vision of pride in white America from being tarnished from association with neo-Nazis." And later on in the article, Graham said this, quote, "Trump is trying to draw a line around a group of people who have beliefs that are substantially similar to those of white nationalists, and in some matters, neo-Nazis, who are literally willing to march alongside them and to make them acceptable in polite society because they say they are not neo-Nazis or white nationalists, but simply wish to protect their culture." I mean, pause. Think about that. This is a distinction without a difference. These are people who have the same ideology as white supremacists and neo-Nazis. These are people who are willing to go out and march next to Nazis and white supremacists and neo-Nazis. These are people who are willing to be seen and associated with and involved in violence with them. But Donald Trump is saying that they're different because they don't carry the name. What difference does it make if you have the same ideology? At the core, white grievance is the ideology. What difference does it make if you're willing to march next to them, willing to be seen with them, and to support them because you have something in common? What difference does it make? And this is where Donald Trump is actually a master, and he's far from incompetent here. He's far from a buffoon here. This is very intentional. And you see that on the one hand, the president of the United States will go through painstaking contortions in order to absolve people with white grievance ideology from any culpability or responsibility to the violence that's going on. This white supremacist murder spree that the gentleman on Twitter referred to. And in the midst of that, we have one new data point that shows that this is a problem in this country. And in the presence of that most recent data point, Austin, Texas, the president of the United States said nothing for 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And when he did say something, a man who's able to give verbal contortions of the likes that we saw in Charlottesville had nothing but empty platitudes that were consistent with his buffoonery that he uses as a guise to cover the fact that he is, in fact, the master of white supremacy. And so I think it's vitally important that we no longer consider Donald Trump as a moron. His ignorance and his buffoonery is cover for a very strategic agenda. And it's difficult for people to accept at face value, but his agenda is simply using white grievance for political gain. Or perhaps his agenda is straight out white grievance. I don't really care, because to me, it's a distinction without a difference, because he's demonstrated unfeigned loyalty to white supremacy and white grievance. And so whether it's because he genuinely believes it in his heart or it's merely a political game for him to get power, it doesn't matter. The end result is the same. And so we need to start considering every move that Donald Trump makes, particularly in this arena, as strategic if we're ever going to counteract it. And to be sure, I want to outline precisely what he does. It is a formula for him. Number one, Donald Trump refuses. You'll see in every press conference of relevance, Donald Trump will not speak about any violence committed by white extremists unless he is forced to. Look at Austin, Texas today. Yesterday was the first time in 3 weeks that he spoke of it, and that's only because journalists asked him about it and he was forced to talk about it. And that should be a lesson for journalists to ask him. He is not going to bring it up. He is not going to tweet about it. He's not going to say anything about it until you ask him. And then number two, when he is forced to do this, he offers vague condemnation that can easily be dismissed. He condemns in vague, ambiguous platitudes that never, ever approaches the root of the problem, which is white grievance ideologies. The belief that white people are suffering in this country, the belief that brown people are taking over, the belief that brown people and black people are pimping the system and taking from them, and the belief that you make the belief of a person on food stamps, that they really fear and get angry that a black person on food stamps is taking advantage of the system, even though they are the one who is on food stamps. It's a game. It's a masterful game, and Donald Trump is the king of it. And finally, number three, Donald Trump neatly carves out a safe space for his white grievance base to never allow them to consider that their belief system is wrong and that it is the driving force behind the most extremist related murders in this country. He'll never address the core issue, and he carves out a place for them to hide, to never have to deal with the fact that what they believe, what he talks about, what he enables, what Fox News has built an entire industry around, is at the core of the most the extremist murders that we see. The core of it is the same ideology that Donald Trump peddles and enables. And while he enables it, he simultaneously keeps. He's like the Pied Piper of white supremacy. He's able to lure them in, and he draws them in. He enables them, and then he protects them from any, he lulls them to sleep. He gives them a way to never have to deal with the fact that, yes, white person who feels like black people are taking over this country, your way of thinking is actually the ideology that drives the white murder spree that is happening in this country right now. Your way of thinking, your ideology is at the center. It is the core driving force behind the fact that in 2017, 60%, around 60% of all extremist related murders were committed by right-wing extremists. And if you for 1 second had any genuine concern about extremism in this country, terrorism in this country, if you actually gave one damn about that, what you talk about, then you would have to stop and reflect, how is it that my white grievance ideology is at the core of what is driving all of the murders that are committed by right-wing extremists in this country? And they would come to terms with the fact that they are responsible for the most terrorism in this country. But that's an entirely different episode, because they're not willing to even label it domestic terrorism. And that is a standard move in the United States played by white supremacy to ensure that white violence committed by angry, conservative-leaning, white grievance Americans will never be held accountable, will never be looked at collectively, and we will never pause to think, wow, there is a murder spree happening in this country, and it's being committed by people who believe that white people are oppressed in this country. It's being committed by people who endorse and embrace the white grievance philosophy. And at the core of that, at the top of that heap, is the President of the United States. That's all the time I have for you today. Thanks so much for hanging out with me. I always appreciate the time we spend together. Go to patreon.com/the BPD show and support our very minor fundraiser. It's not really a huge thing. It's a couple dollars a month. $500 more a month is our goal. And if you hit that for us, then we can make some moves. As a matter of fact, I'm sure somebody in the audience can say, like, Ben, I just don't want to hear any more commercials for this. So here's $500 a month that we'll commit to your show. Well, you know, save everyone else the hassle. But in case that doesn't happen, the rest of you, go to patreon.com. Support the show however you can. Help us get back into video as we build this thing. Thanks for hanging out again. I will see you tomorrow.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.